let's talk about digital segmentation. So I'm actually going to show you a little bit of an analysis here that transcends how well does the website work. Because in segmentation, we're actually a little more focused on who uses the web channel and why. And in fact, within this, I think you guys have probably seen at least some of this before. So I'm going to try to touch on it pretty lightly. But this idea that almost any kind of analysis you want to do, and really any kind of reporting you want to do, needs to begin with a customer segmentation. And I try to describe this to people in a couple different ways, but one of them is as simple as, if I sit down with somebody and I say that their traffic is up 5%, the first question I really want them to ask is, with whom? Because it makes a huge difference whether that's with customers, whether it's with prospects, whether it's with people we know or people we don't know, whether it's with high wealth people or low wealth people, whether it's with people who are great prospects or poor prospects. So who they are is vital to any business. And I think that's true across all marketing stuff, right? There's nothing distinct about analytics here. I'd want to ask the same question for any kind of marketing campaign or any kind of marketing effort that I had. The second type of question is a little more digital specific, because once I've asked that question and answered that question, who is it? The second thing you want to ask and answer is, and why were they there? And again, the thing is that a lot of times websites are multi-purpose, and a lot of times people don't recognize that. You know, if you're an e-commerce shop, you tend to think that every single visitor who shows up on your website is there to buy a product. But they may be there to return a product. They may be there to find out the status of an order. They may be there for, to research some kind of product to figure out what they're going to do. They may be there to create a wish list for themselves, right? There's a whole bunch of reasons why they might be there, and in none of those reasons are you going to sell them a product. So when you do things like create look to book and conversion rates, it's critically important not only you understand who people are, but what their visit intent was, if those metrics and that analysis is going to be meaningful. So this digital thing is important to understand the customer segmentation and also the type of visit they had. And once you've done that, you can take advantage of something that is really, really powerful in traditional database marketing, which is in database marketing, when we built models of who people were, whether they were likely to transact to us, we built models we called RFM models. RFM models are recency, frequency, monetary. How recently has someone done something? How frequently do they do it? And how much money did I make off of it? In the web, I often recast that as recency, frequency, and success, because it's not always about money. A lot of times our clients have successes on their website that have nothing to do with dollar conversion. So an RFM model, in my view, is not necessarily tied up with money. But the thing is that across a wide range of marketing problems, there's no better predictor of what someone's going to do than how recently they did something, how frequently they do something, and how successful they are at it. And this is true across a really wide range of problems, from media sites, how recently someone consumed article content, how frequently they consume article content, and how much advertising load we can pack on that. Those are absolutely as valid in a media site as they are valid for traditional database marketers doing cataloging. So RFM is a really powerful way to think about behavior. But the thing is, you can't use this RFM stuff until you've gotten down to the segmentation level. Unless you know why someone was on the website, there's no point understanding how often they've been on the website. There's no point understanding how successful they are unless you can put that in the context of what they've been trying to do. Someone's on the website all the time because they always need customer support. That's fundamentally different than someone who's on the website a lot because they're always buying things. It's really simple and obvious stuff, but it's really important. And if you don't think about this stuff, you can make some pretty fundamental mistakes. So I always describe digital segmentation as being two-tiered. The first tier is the who. The traditional segmentation, the same stuff that exists in all marketing. The second segmentation is the why. This is visit intent, inferring visit intent. And this is something that, if you've done a use case analysis, as we talked about in the previous thing, or if you've built one of these two-tiered segmentations, that's the hard part, is this visit intent part. It's very difficult. Some websites make it easier than others. It's always a challenge, though, to infer visit intent. But I think it's something that increasingly, as people get more and more sophisticated in digital marketing, this ability to infer intent is going to be the core type of segmentation skill that we have to bring to the table. So a lot of times when we build segmentations, we're doing it in tools like Discover, and we're building rule-based segmentations. But if we really want to do a really professional job on this, a lot of times we need to do a full-on behavioral segmentation outside of web analytics tools. And there's a couple steps to doing that. The first, and I think this is actually important irrespective of where you're doing the segmentation, is content metadata categorization. What do I mean by that? Well, the thing is that if you're trying to infer visit intent, it's really important to know what someone looking at a page means. And a lot of times our clients do a really poor job of this, right? They may have a product detail page, but it doesn't say anything about what kind of product this is. And when they flow information into the web analytics, they might have the product category, but they might not have any additional information, like, is this a high-end product? Is this a brand name product? You know, if I'm shopping on Costco, am I looking at Kirkland products or am I looking at brand name products? It's a huge difference. It's a huge difference in who this buyer is, right? But that's the kind of stuff we never capture in a web analytics solution. If I'm a content site, what type of content is this? Is this for a deep fan? If it's a sports site, is it a casual fan? Is it scoring updates? Is it day after kind of stuff, or is it stuff you really dive down into and know about a team? Well, that's interesting kind of segmentation variables. No analyst is going to be able to build this stuff post hoc, right? We deal with large websites. A lot of times they're flowing thousands of pages out to their website on a daily basis. If they're not appending metadata to it, it'll never get baked into the analysis. So one of the most important things you can do in building an implementation, and one of the hardest things to sell a client on, is getting as much metadata description as possible. And there's a whole wide range of these things, but the more you have of this stuff, the better job you can do in doing segmentation. It's really a case of, you know, segmentation is totally data driven, and the better data you have, the better the analysis is going to be. Getting that data is really the hard work on this. And as an analyst, if you have to go and classify pages by hand, likely we're never going to do it, right? We don't get paid enough to do it in most cases, so we don't have the time. But so it's really important up front to do that work. Site topology definition, this is what I talked about in the previous analysis. If you've got a site topology, if you've got good content metadata categorization, you can do pretty effective visitor clustering. Cluster analysis is a way of taking lots of different data points, standardizing them across your visitor population, and then looking for groups of people who tend to have similar patterns. That's really all it is. It looks across a wide set of variables and clusters people together who tend to do similar kinds of things on the website. It's not a navigational technique. It's not a before and after technique. It looks at the sum total of behavior and it clusters people who tend to have similar patterns. It's usually the technique we use for behavioral analysis, although there are a lot, behavioral segmentation, although there are a lot of different choices from a statistical analysis perspective. Then you get to this last problem, which is once you've created clusters of people, one of the things you'll often get asked these days, and I think this is becoming more and more important, is how quickly can I assign people to a segment? Because a lot of times people want to do personalization and targeting off these segmentation issues. So a lot of times what you have to do is build rules that allow you to, as quickly as possible, assess what segment someone looks like they're going to be in, and then create projected segment codes for them. So when you build a cluster analysis, one very common follow-on to that is to create a set of rules for how quickly you can assign people to a projected cluster. And the faster you can do this, sometimes it's a single visit, sometimes it's inside a visit, sometimes it's multiple. It kind of depends on the analysis. But one thing to keep in mind is if the client is going to want to do personalization on using this segmentation, and particularly if they want to do intra-visit segmentation, then it's really important to build clusters that are going to allow you as quickly as possible to identify what the visit intent is. So hopefully after someone does 1 or 2 clicks off the home page, you're able to assign them to a segment. And sometimes that means sacrificing granularity and sophistication in the cluster analysis, but if the client wants to use it for that kind of targeting, that's what you have to do, because there's no use waiting to the end of the session to make a personalization recommendation to somebody. By that time it's all over. So a lot of times the way you build the clusters needs to be dependent on how they're actually going to be used.
Do you ever bake in the ability to switch assignments during the visit?
Yeah, you almost have to, right? Because you're going to be wrong. I mean, I think the bottom line on that is that really, if you build those kinds of rules, it almost has to be the case that each time you're doing an interaction, you're reassessing what segment they're in, because there's no doubt that you know, as you try to aggressively put people into segments, you're going to be wrong a fair amount of the time. So, absolutely. So key steps in the segmentation. One, deciding on a time frame. Surprisingly tricky. You want to make sure you get enough behavior. If people are really focused on long-term visitor behaviors, you need to pick pretty long time frames. One trick here, though, is be aware that particularly on the non-identified web, this might not be an issue for Vanguard or Charles Schwab, but if you're talking about the prospect side of things, or you're talking about sites where a lot of people aren't, where the tracking is cookie-based, you're going to lose the vast majority of people over a 3 to 6 month period. Their cookies are going to get deleted. They're going to switch browsers. They're going to switch computers. They're going to go between multiple machines. In general, you're going to lose maybe half your population in about 3 months' time. And in another 3 months' time, you're going to lose another half of that again. And your half-life is going to keep going down. So if you try to do an analysis that looks at people over a 2-year period, by the time you go back 2 years, you might be looking at like 6% of your population. So that's not very good from an analytics perspective. And what it means is that for longer-term visitor level analysis, you may be fundamentally limited on how far back you can go if the data set you have is web analytics. And a lot of times, I try to encourage clients to stick within like a 3-month window because the data is just a lot cleaner that way. One thing we often do recommend for people who are doing behavioral segmentation is integrating survey data. The survey data can't necessarily be used to build the segmentation, because if you do that, you can't use the segmentations for anybody except people who filled out a survey. What you want is a behavioral segmentation that you can use for every single visitor. So why have the survey? The survey allows you to color the segments. Once you've built the segmentation, if you can match it up to survey data, you may find that some segments have very distinct patterns in terms of demographics or attitudes. And that stuff you can use to help the client understand what the segments are. So the survey data is really about coloring the segmentation, not building the segmentation. You have to get a data feed for this, so you have to get data from the client. It's like an Omniture data feed. You have to do some significant data transformation to do this kind of cluster analysis. So the cluster analysis does not work at the individual server call level. It works typically at the visit level or the visitor level, sometimes both, which means you have to aggregate the data up to that level. So we use like our ETL tool, and then a lot of times, like when Paul builds these things, we'll build a bunch of custom aggregations into the data. And that can be done either on the SQL side or on the ETL side, but there's a significant amount of data transformation that goes into this. Session identification, stringing people together across visits is often a fundamental part of what you want to do here. Final transformation and normalization. A lot of times when you do this kind of analysis, you want all of your variables expressed in terms of standard deviations from the norm for that variable. That basically the reason you want that is so that every variable is equally weighted in the analysis, or that you can explicitly control the weighting. What happens is that a lot of variables have different ranges, and a variable with a really wide range of variability can dominate the analysis over something with a short range of variability. If you don't want that to happen, and usually you don't, you want to standardize all the variables flowing into the analysis. Then you build the actual segmentation. Notice this is like step 8 or whatever of this, and maybe even and that's obviously a really important step. But this next to last step is also really important. Once you built the segmentation, you have to find a way to describe the segments back to the client. That's a profiling exercise. To do that, you really run a bunch of frequencies on. So if I take this segment, I look at not only the formula that defines that segment, but a lot of times I'll run a bunch of frequency tables on people who are in the segment to really get a picture of their overall behavior. I'll use the survey data to look at, are there differences in their demographics? Are there differences in their attitudes? Building crisp profiles for a segmentation is maybe the single most important step from the client's perspective. This is what the client sees, and if these aren't compelling, no matter how good a work you did in building the segmentation, they're not going to take advantage of it. So profiling is really, really important.